Welcome to Radical AI, a podcast about radical ideas, radical people, and radical stories at the intersection of ethics and artificial intelligence. We are your hosts, Dylan and Jess. And welcome to our third Minisode. If you haven't listened to a Minisode before, you can expect to hear a little bit of updates about what Dylan and I have been up to behind the scenes, some shout outs to some events and people and organizations, and also just some current events, as well as a longer extended debrief the last month of episodes that we have released on the podcast.
And oh my God, Jess, we have so much to cover in such a short amount of time on this minisode. So first and foremost, we want to thank you all so much for continuing to download and listen over the short 2 months that we've been around since launch. We've had over 6,500 unique downloads, and it's just been, a wild ride. We continue to be incredibly humbled for you all tuning in time and time again with these conversations that we're having with these amazing and visionary leaders in our world right now and in the tech industry and in academia. Their voices are so important, and it's such a privilege for us to be able to share those voices with you.
And we also wanted to mention that it wouldn't be right for us to release and record this episode right now in the context of current events that we are living in without recognizing what's going on in the world around us. And we're talking about the murder of George Floyd, the riots and protests, and finally facing and acknowledging all of the systemic racism that is surrounding us, not only in the United States, but in the world at large. And we are just really grateful to be able to be having these conversations with some of the people who are really great leaders in this space. And speaking of great leaders in this space, we actually had the opportunity last night on Friday, June 12th, to attend a virtual film festival where we got to watch the film Coded Bias, which was created by Shalini Kantaya. And this was part of the Human Rights Watch Film Festival, which was followed by a live online Q&A session. And you guys, this was such a cool event. We were so stoked to be a part of it. If you haven't seen the film Coded Bias, please go and watch it as soon as you can. It's still available on the Human Rights Watch Film Festival website. It's just $9 to rent it. I think it's available for rental for at least another few days, if not the next week or so. And it follows the journey of Joy Buolamwini and the fight for algorithmic justice. There's not much I could say that would do it justice because it's just so moving, but I really, really recommend if you are at all interested in this space to go watch it. And even if you're not a researcher or an academic, it is relevant to everyone, believe me. And this panel, which was just filled with like academic celebrities to me, was so amazing. So this featured Joy Buolamwini herself, Dr. Sophia Noble, Deb Raji, Lee Rowland, Shalini Kantaya, Deborah Brown, who was moderating it, and they were kind of just debriefing the film and then also some of their experiences with disseminating this research in the first place. And there's actually a recording from the Human Rights Watch Film Festival of the Q&A session that was created, and I think that it's available for everyone for free. So if you weren't there for the live Q&A session, I really recommend you go and listen and watch that because it was really incredible. Some other really quick shout outs and updates. If you hadn't noticed, we have new branding and we are so excited about this. Dylan wrote a nice blog post on Medium about some of our struggles and our lessons that we learned in the process of creating our new logo. And we want to shout out to Maria Deslis for working so hard and diligently with us for weeks to create that and iterating on the process. And we also want to shout out to Sho McClarence, who created our first logo, which was so helpful for us when we were launching the podcast. And another shout out that we want to do is to Jenny LaJoya, who actually is the person who created our theme music that you hear in the intro and outro of all of our episodes. And we haven't shouted out her name yet because we keep forgetting. So now, thank you so much, Jenny. We are in love with your music, and we hope that our listeners are enjoying it too. And the last update is the YouTube channel that we finally launched, or at least it was launched a little while ago, but we finally started putting videos on it. If you're looking for a different medium or platform to listen to some of our episodes or some other community updates, we are actually finally being active on our YouTube channel. So you can look us up at the Radical AI podcast on YouTube, and you will see all of our full episodes and some excerpts, like Timnit's excerpt from her episode regarding the current events, which we will go into a little bit more in our debrief, which, speaking of, is time, now that we have gone over all of the at least immediate updates, it's time to now go into our monthly debrief from the last 4 and really 5 episodes of the Radical AI podcast.
The interviews that we will be debriefing in this minisode are our interview with Karen Howe, who is the AI reporter for the MIT Technology Review, our interview with Abeba Berhani, a cognitive science PhD student at University College Dublin, Unso Joe, who is a history PhD candidate at Stanford, our interview with Timnit Gebru, who is the co-lead of the ethical AI team at Google, and finally, our interview with Yeshi Milner, the executive director of Data for Black Lives.
And let's kick it off with our first episode, which was Tech Journalism and Ethics, Where is the Truth Anyway? With Karen Howe. So in this episode, I think one of my initial takeaways that I actually really liked, she explained in the interview that because she understands what it's like to not understand things like machine learning and artificial intelligence, that's why she's so motivated, or at least one of the reasons why she's so motivated to try to create tools and stories and activities and really great resources for other people who also don't come from computer science to be able to utilize these resources to understand things like algorithmic bias and AI ethics, which I thought was just really great because I've been in that situation before, and I've also been the person in the computer science classroom who doesn't understand what's going on, at least when I was initially learning computer science, and honestly all the time, even as I'm still getting my PhD right now. And so I love when people try to take difficult technical concepts and turn them into really great resources that are understandable by anyone, whether they come from a computer science background or not. So that was one of the first takeaways that I really enjoyed about Karen's interview. And what about you, Dylan? What were some of the takeaways for you?
I had a lot of fun with this interview. I had a good time talking about, marriage and commiserating with Karen about, friends having kids and not having kids myself and things like that. So I had a good time with the interview. Also, as I think I mentioned in the interview, I've always been interested in journalism. So to listen to some of the stories of someone who's really blazing some trails right now in journalism and in AI ethics journalism was just it was just really cool to hear how she sees her job, and especially when she started talking about this concept of objectivity and about truth, and how there isn't necessarily a thing called truth, right? As this idea that she was bringing up about it being consensus information. So this interview was also a way for me to scratch some of my philosophy itch, because as I'm doing some moral philosophy work, this concept of truth and objectivity that we sometimes, take for granted, especially in computer science spaces, that there's something that, actually exists out there that is more than just this intersubjective space is, it was just a good conversation for me, and reminded me of some of the things I believe and also some of the things that I don't believe.
Yeah, that seems to be a recurring theme in our interviews, is this idea of truth and objectivity and whether or not it's actually something that exists or something that we can capture through data. And that was actually something that we talked quite a bit about with Unso Joe. And I know this is a little bit out of order, but Unso's episode was our bonus episode, which is the first time we've done this at all with our podcast. And that was just such a fun process where we kind of went through an old interview that you had done before we met, actually, and we kind of just talked over and paused the interview and gave our running commentary, which was just like a fun experience. But yeah, Unso's episode, we already talked way too much about it during the episode. So if you'd like to hear much more about our thoughts, we recommend that you go and listen to The History That Defines Our Technological Future. But I'll just say one quick takeaway from that is, for me at least, this idea that data is political. And this is a phrase I feel like I've been repeating over and over again in my head and also out loud to all my colleagues. They're probably sick of it. Ever since we recorded this episode, I just keep saying it over and over again. Data is political.
Yeah, so obviously this was an interview that I did before we got together to do this podcast, Jess. And I mean, I loved the conversation with Unso at the time, and listening back on it, there were just so many things that I wish that I had done or said differently. So it was a cool experience to hear my perspective, and then also your helpful critique of different things that I could have done, better or differently. Because I think that just like even in the 2 months of work that we've done together, we've grown so much as interviewers and in really centering their stories. So while I'm still very proud of that interview, and I think the work that Unso is doing is amazing, especially bringing history and archives into this conversation about justice and algorithms, I learned a lot, and I just, it was the most editing that we ever did in an episode in putting everything together, and it was just a lot of fun. I don't know. I had a really good time of listening back. It was a really good learning experience for me. So
I'm glad that you enjoyed the editing process, because as our resident editor, you're the person who spent the hours editing that episode. So I'm glad that it was enjoyable for you. And
well, yeah, I mean, enjoyable. Yeah, it was fun. The recording was more fun than the editing. But one thing I did want to circle back to, and this is something that, as you said, is coming up a lot in our conversations with people, is that everyone just seems to be in dialogue with the Enlightenment right now, with this idea of objective science, that reason is the thing that has to prevail, these basic concepts that were quote unquote created, or at least instituted in the 17th century in Europe at the same time that colonialism was coming up. It's we keep finding ourselves in because I noted the same thing that you did. We keep talking about objectivity, and I'm wondering to myself, what is that about? And it's well, we really never got over like we could this colonialism or the Enlightenment context that it came out of. It's still so much a specter in everything we do, including in the technology space. And in this time when we're grappling with white supremacy and trying to dismantle systemic racism, it's so important, as our guests continue to remind us, to look at the context. And that's not just the context right here and right now, but it's the context through hundreds and hundreds of years of oppression, mostly, and again, of that systematic racism. And this is something that Timnit brought up a lot in her interview, where we asked her to speak directly to you all listeners about, so we had recorded the episode, and then about a week later, the world had changed considerably. And so we'd asked Timnit to give a message to everyone responding to what's going on, and she graciously accepted. And her message, in part, was about how it's not just the United States. It's not just here. This is a global context that we are interacting with.
Yeah, and I want to circle back actually to when you were talking about the Enlightenment and colonization, and I think that we can't even use the word colonization without bringing up, obviously, our interview with Abeba Berhane, which is titled Robot Rights, Exploring Algorithmic Colonization. And that's actually one of her papers, is the algorithmic colonization of Africa, which is basically leading to the fact that not data is not the only thing that is political here. Algorithms are political as well. And when we're talking about this idea of objectivity, and if there's even such a thing as objective truth when it comes to the world, when we take that idea and we put it into our algorithms, we run into even more problems. And this was actually my biggest takeaway from Abeba's interview, was her comment on the fact that machine learning algorithms are increasingly trying to predict the inherently unpredictable. And this is when machine learning tries to predict some sort of social outcome for a human being. This could be something like recidivism risks, so their likelihood to recommit a crime. This could be their worthiness of credit based off of their trustworthiness when it comes to money. And this is all just to say that human beings are super incredibly complex. I don't think that I could even predict what I'm going to do today in a social context. And I am myself, and I know everything there is to know about me, arguably more than anyone else or anything else in the entire world. And I still couldn't predict exactly what I'm going to do given any context. So how in the world are we supposed to expect an algorithm that is fed nothing but data that's incomplete? How can we expect a machine learning algorithm to predict a social outcome or a social action of a human being when we can't even do it ourselves?
One of the quotes from Abeba's interview that has really stuck with me, especially with the riots and the protests of the last few weeks, has been when she said that colonialism is not a bug, it's the feature. And that although some people argue that we're in this post-colonial space, that we really can't reasonably argue that when so many of our structures derive directly from a colonial history. And so, I really invite listeners to let that sink in for a second. What would it mean if colonialism is not the bug, but it's the feature of the systems that we're in? And I think this really does tie into a lot of what Timnit was talking about, which was more structural. And we had a wonderful conversation with Dr. Gabriel about really who is pulling the strings in all of this. And we talked about, is there a difference between the academy and industry? And Timnit essentially said, sort of, in part, there might be, but really it's the same people. It's the same group of people that run both industry and academia. And Jess, you and I spend so much time in thinking about, what guests we're going to have on the show and stuff like that, of saying, okay, well, these people are representing academia and these people are representing industry, and we want a balance, across the board of diversity, including that kind of diversity of different fields. And it kind of took me aback when she said that, because I think she's right. It's when I think about even Ivy League institutions and the amount of people who are currently teaching in Ivy League institutions who are also the people who are the primary consultants in the tech industry, which is nothing against any of those people. And it's also there is a particular pattern and there's a particular structure that creates. And it makes you wonder, does that have something to do with this colonial history that we're living out of right now?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Dylan. And I think something else that actually stood out to me about Timnit's interview, while we're talking about this idea of select few people being in the room who are making these big decisions at large tech companies and who are sitting high up on the totem pole in academia, is the topic of representation, which was really pervasive throughout the entire interview with Timnit.
And after that conversation with Timnit, I still wondered, there isn't any quick fix here, right? It's such a deep structural change that needs to happen. And that's what I see in the protests happening right now, is this, hopefully, the shift towards trying to make lasting structural change in our systems, where racism and sexism and all sorts of other isms, I guess, are just so deeply ingrained in them. And Yeshi, I think, got to the heart of this with some of the questions that she was asking, really asking these holistic questions she said, we have to address some of these things specifically, but it's also, some spiritual questions as well. And she said, how do we respond with love? Which is the same thing that we heard from our interview with Dr. Ruha Benjamin, this concept of love. How do we bring love into it? And Yeshi also asked, how do we create community right now? How do we hold space for people? And then another question that she asked is, after all these protests are over, whatever that means, what happens when folks are out of jail, and what happens when the protest ends? Like, people need community spaces of healing and organizing and justice and restorative justice spaces. So how do we create these spaces even within, our workplaces, even within academia, even within all these different spaces that we frequent? It's not just this, okay, well, we do the diversity hire, and representation isn't just this shallow thing. It's really asking us to, it's inviting us, I guess, to ask these really deep structural questions of, like, how do we restructure these things that we take for granted and these systems that we take for granted in order to build something that can be sustainable for everyone? Because right now, what's obvious is that these systems out in the world are not sustainable for everyone. And they're not looking out for everyone. They're looking out for a select group of people of a certain race, possibly a certain gender. And we've seen that, the evidence is over the past however many hundreds of years. So there's still that question. And there's definitely been some hope these past few weeks in these conversations and these protests. And I think in the tech industry, there's a lot of work still to be done.
Yeah, and speaking of breaking down systems, this is what Yeshi Milner is all about as the executive director of Data for Black Lives. And one of the things that she mentioned that she's helping to break down is this political data that we've been talking about, and how data has historically been used for weaponization. And this is in things like predictive policing, risk assessments, facial recognition, FICO credit scores. There's just so many examples of how data has been used for bad. And she's trying to change the narrative here and instead use data for social change to help create an equitable world. And I just love the Data for Black Lives tagline, I guess, that's on their website: the data as protest, data as accountability, and data as collective action. That is just, I think, such a beautiful way to phrase how, or some of the many ways that we can use data for positive social change. And I also wanted to take this opportunity to give a shout out to some of the amazing organizations that have just been doing great work in this space, especially over the last few weeks, who have probably had a lot of the people who are working for them and volunteering for them working countless hours, as I'm sure there have been many requests for interviews and for other forms of media to share resources. And so some of these organizations are Data for Black Lives, of course, Black in AI, the Algorithmic Justice League, and also another shout out that I wanted to give was actually from the Center for Critical Internet Inquiry, which is directed by Sophia Noble and Sarah Roberts. They came out with a reading list that is 15 books on racial justice and technology by Black scholars that the tech industry needs to read right now. And it is linked on their Twitter and on their website. And we'll also put a link to that in the show notes as well.
Yeah, and I think to kind of close this conversation, one quote that has really stuck with me, and it is from Joy and also Aina Agarwal and Sasha Constanza Schock, so from the Algorithmic Justice League. They wrote this amazing op-ed on Medium. We'll also link that in our show notes, called IBM Leads, More Should Follow. Racial Justice Requires Algorithmic Justice. And this is about IBM announcing that they're going to oppose and not condone any use of facial recognition technology for mass surveillance or racial profiling. And the way that they end this piece is by simply saying, racial justice requires algorithmic justice. Take a stand backed with action. And so our hope for you all who are listening out there is that wherever you're at, that you take a stand backed with action. And that might be reading, that might be marching. There are many different ways from where we're each situated. You know, for Jess and I, it's hopefully to do this podcast, right? And to lift up some of these voices. But wherever you're at, we do really invite you to please take a stand backed with action, and to remember these words from Joy and all, that racial justice requires algorithmic justice. It isn't this like extra thing, right? This is pivotal to the fight for racial justice right now.
And we will have many more conversations upcoming about some of the current events regarding companies like IBM and Amazon and their decision to ban this facial recognition technology, at least for now. And of course, we could talk about algorithmic justice and political data and political algorithms for hours. But as this is a mini-sode, we are going to try to keep it as short as humanly possible. So with that, this concludes the debrief of this month's episodes. And we just want to briefly mention that we welcome all kinds of feedback on the way that we interview, the way that we structure our episodes and our hosts and our minisodes as well. So if you want to provide any feedback for us, please don't hesitate to send us an email or reach out on Twitter. And also, if you're looking to help show your support, something that is really beneficial for us is if you actually rate and give a review of the podcast on whichever platform you are watching or whichever platform you're listening to the podcast on, especially if it is iTunes, as that helps us get lifted up by the algorithm, ironically. And as well, if you can subscribe and share with your friends, we just want to get these conversations with these amazing scholars and these amazing leaders out to as many people as we possibly can.
Well, and Jess, now people can technically watch the podcast on YouTube, although it's not video, but like you can definitely hit that play button and the little thing will scroll. So they can watch it.
And they can watch the thumbnail.
That's right. You can watch the thumbnail. It's a great. There are great thumbnails. And we also just really quickly, Jess makes the thumbnails. We want to quickly plug our upcoming interviews that we will be releasing, including with Dr. Miriam Sweeney, Dr. Emily Bender, Dr. Anima Anand Kumar, Deb Raji, and of course others. And please stay tuned. And thank you so much for joining us for this minisode.
If you enjoyed this episode, we invite you to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or your favorite podcatcher. Join our conversation on Twitter at RadicalAIPod. And, as always, stay radical.
So sorry. Stay radical. Stay radical.
You feeling radical today?
I'm feeling so radical today. I was.